Hey everybody, this video is called Look After the Poor, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Deuteronomy, looking at chapter 15, where we're going to look at the laws regarding the taking care of the poor. And so we're going to look at Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 through 6 starting out. It says, "At the end of every 7 years you shall grant a release of debts. And this is the form of the release. Every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Of a foreigner who may require it, but you shall give up your claim to what is owed by your brother, except when they may be no poor among you. For the Lord will greatly bless you in the land which the Lord your God has given you to possess as an inheritance. Only if you carefully obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe with care all the commandments which I command you today. For the Lord your God will bless you, just as he promised you. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. You shall reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over you." So the sabbatical year was established and described back in the book of Exodus chapter 23 verses 10 and 11, and also Leviticus chapter 25 verse 1 through 7. And within those chapters talking about it, they state that in the 7th year the land was to lie uncultivated with crops or without crops planted. And here in Deuteronomy we see Moses prescribed a cancellation of debts to go along with it. And on the basis of verses 9 through 11, the debt was canceled completely and permanently. It was not just during a sabbatical year. And the release of the debts wasn't intended for foreigners, but citizens, so that the foreigners, they would still be responsible for their debts that they owed. In verse 4 through 6, it was an encouragement to strive for a reduction of poverty, while at the same time they stressed the abundance of the provision that God would make in the promised land. And the release of debt was God's release in verse 2. And I want to pre-read verse 11 here. It says, "For the poor will never cease from the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall open your hand wide to your brother, to the poor, your poor, and your needy in the land." And if God is contradicting himself here in the chapter, as verse 4 said, there may be no poor among you. So how can it say in verse 4 that there may be no poor among you, but in verse 11, just a few verses later, it says that there will be? And it's not a contradiction at all. And God knew that he had established a system where no one was chronically poor, but he knew that there would be disobedience to come, because God is omniscient, God is all-knowing. So there would always be, as a result, poor in Israel. And God guaranteed opportunity to prosperity for an obedient Israel, and they would enjoy God's prosperity and be blessed above other nations. In verse 7 through 11 here, it says, "If there is among you a poor man of your brethren within any of the gates in your land, which the Lord your God has given you, you shall not harden your heart, nor shut your hand from your poor brother, but you shall open your hand wide to him, and willingly lend him sufficient for his need, whatever he needs. Beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release, is at hand, and your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry out to the Lord against you, and it become sin among you. You shall surely give to him, and your heart shouldn't be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your works, and in all to which you put your hand. For the poor will never cease from the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall open your hand wide to your brother, to your poor and your needy in your land." So the law of release in the 7th year was never to be used to discourage giving to those in need. And the law may discourage them from lending to the poor. Therefore, God wanted to see Israel be generous givers to those in need. And the poor was given whatever was necessary to meet their needs, even with the realization that such loans would never be paid back. And, we're not looking at AOC's book of, college free payoffs and everything. We're looking at the Bible here. And as mentioned, due to disobedience, there would always be poor people in the land. In verse 12 through 15, says, if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and serves you 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you send him away free from you, you shall not let him go away empty-handed. You shall supply him liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress. From what the Lord has blessed you with, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this day, today. And given the context of this chapter in verses 1 through 11, the reason for the sale would be to default an alternative repayment of a debt. And a period of servitude would substitute for that repayment. And when you look at slavery in the Bible, or bond servants, it's not the slavery that was wicked just, a couple hundred years ago here in the United States of America. And the Hebrew slave would serve his master for 6 years, following the sale of freedom being declared in the 7th year. In the 7th year, a slave would be free. And when the slave completed their time of service, his former owner was to make sufficient provision for him so that when he began his new state of life, being outside of slavery, that he would be able to succeed. And the Israelites, who were formerly enslaved in Egypt, they were to treat their own slaves as God had treated them. So their slaves were not to be treated as less in meaning or less among them. They were to be treated with dignity and respect. In verse 16 through 18, it says, and if it happens that he says to you, I will not go away from you because he loves you in your house. Since he prospers with you, then you shall take an awl and thrust it through the air to the door, and he shall be your servant forever. Also to your female servant you shall do likewise. It shall not seem hard to you when you send him away free from you. For he has been worth a double hired servant in serving you 6 years. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. And if a slave loved his master and wanted to continue serving him, he had the right to do so. And he wasn't required to leave his master at the end of the 7th year. And in the stay-in, the slave was marked with a hole in his ear, and he became a servant forever, as seen back in Exodus chapter 21, verse 5 and 6. And the slave was worth double to his owner, because the owner not only had the service of the slave, but what he needed to get done, got done, and it would save him money from having to pay out for that service. And a stay-in slave declared love and devotion to his master, as they were free to choose, but they make the choice to stay as a servant to their master. In verse 19, it says, all the firstborn males that come from your herd in your flock you shall sanctify to the Lord your God. You shall do no work with the firstborn of your herd, nor share the firstborn of your flock. Verse 20 starts with the word you, so we'll hold off there for a second. But the firstborn was the first to be produced during the barren life of an animal, and it was consecrated to the Lord. And the firstborn would be sacrificed annually, and the offerers would participate in a sacrifice person's male. And the firstborn ox or bull wasn't to be worked, nor the firstborn sheep or goat shaved in the time before their sacrifice to the Lord. In verse 20 through 23, to wrap up the chapter, it says, you and your household shall eat it, before the Lord your God year by year in the place which the Lord chooses. But if there be a defect in it, if it is lame or blind or has any serious defect, you shall not sacrifice it to the Lord your God. You may eat it within your gates. The unclean and the clean person alike may eat it. As if it were a gazelle or a deer. Only you shall not eat its blood. You shall pour it on the ground like water. So as stated, the sacrificing family would eat a joyful ceremonial meal before the Lord, and an imperfect firstborn animal was not acceptable as a sacrifice, and it was to be treated like any other non-sacrificial animals and eaten at home, as you can find in the book of Malachi chapter 1 verse 6 through 14. So to wrap up the chapter, this chapter is more of a reflection back from the book of Exodus and Leviticus that Moses already spoke about. But we looked at the laws regarding the poor with the command of the release of debt every 7 years. And God commanded generosity to the poor. And Moses reflected on the command that slaves who became slaves to pay off their debt through becoming a slave, they were to be free, or given the option to be free, at the 7th year. In Galatians chapter 6 verse 10, it says, "Therefore we have opportunity. Let us do good to all, especially those who are of the household of faith." And given to the poor is to begin with the brothers and sisters around us that we know. You know, those among our church body, we should be generous too. And they are our church members, and not just church members. I believe you can put it as your co-workers. It's the people you do life with every day. And also in verse 11, Jesus went on to preach the same message in the gospel according to Matthew chapter 26. And we'll look at verse 11. It says here, "For you have the poor with you always, but me you do not always have." And so a woman anointed Jesus in Matthew chapter 26 at Bethany, at Simon's home, by pouring the perfume over him. And the disciples thought it was a waste of money and a waste of perfume. But Jesus told her that, you know, what she's doing is a great deed. And Moses covered the law of the bond slave. And the ultimate fulfillment of the bond servant is Jesus. And Jesus was the ultimate fulfiller of the will and bond slave of God the Father. And Jesus was shown in his sufferings at the cross. And likewise, we ought to be Christ-like, so we ought to be willing as slaves to fully commit to God. As when you come to God in faith, it's not just a temporary, a quick decision, easy decision. It's a lifelong commitment. And it's a lifelong permanent relationship. And I want to go over to Galatians chapter 6, verse 17. It says here, "And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God." Oh, that's Ephesians. Let's go over one more book. Sorry. But Ephesians 6:17 is also a good verse. But Galatians 6:17 sounds more like it. "From now on, let no one trouble me, for I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus." So what does the Apostle Paul mean that he bears the marks of Jesus on him? And he refers to himself as a slave for life unto Jesus. And Moses was reflecting on the law and principle of the firstborn in chapter 15. And Moses reflected on what to do with the giving of the firstborn. And that's going to wrap up this video. We'll see you next week as we're going to look at 3 major feasts. So I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. God bless.